Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Welcome to this evening's webinar discussion on climate change projections for Ireland. I can see a lot of familiar names already in the list of attendees. My name is Dr. Cara Augustenborg. I'm an Environmental Policy Fellow at University College Dublin and also presenter of the Down to Earth show and podcasts on News Talk FM. This evening's webinar is actually one of over 70 online and in-person events which are part of the inaugural Dublin Climate Action Week, and I'd urge you to check out all the other events this week at dublinclimateactionweek.ie. Dublin Climate Action Week has been organized and delivered through a partnership which includes Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council, South Dublin County Council, Dublin City Council, Fingal County Council, CODEMA, which is Dublin's energy agency, and the Dublin Climate Action Regional Office, or CARO. And the overall vision of Dublin Climate Action Week 2021 is to highlight Dublin's climate action progress to its citizens, which is you, and demonstrate the leadership role of the 4 local authorities in conjunction with other partners. So if you're tweeting about the event, you can share our tagline, which is #TakingActionTogether. And the hashtag for Dublin Climate Action Week is DCAW, Dublin Climate Action Week 21. So that's DCAW 21. A reminder that if you have any questions tonight, and we will definitely have time for questions, you can put them into the Q&A, the webinar Q&A, and we have people from the Climate Action Regional Office standing by to help feed those to the panelists later on. So tonight we're talking about climate change, weather, projections for Ireland, all with some esteemed experts, and we'll be discussing things like the difference between climate and weather, the current climate change projections for Ireland up to 2050, which is less than 30 years away now, and how we can adapt to climate impacts that we're experiencing and that we will face in the future. But before I introduce our esteemed panelists, who I know we'll be learning a lot from tonight, we would like to learn something from you, the audience. So starting with a quick poll, we'd like to know what you yourself have noticed or observed in terms of Ireland's changing climate. So you can share this answer with us by going to Slido, that's www.sli.do, and you can enter the code that you see here on the screen. Or if you have your phone handy, you can use your QR code reader there to scan that QR code and it will bring you directly to the live poll on Slido. So what impacts have you been seeing in Ireland? I know for me here in County Wicklow, I'm noticing a lot more erosion on our coastlines as a result of climate change. But what are you observing in your location that may be a sign of climate change? And at the end of this, we'll look at the results in a word cloud after we've talked to our panelists. Great, so I hope you had an opportunity to do that. You can go onto the website at Slido there and put in the code if you didn't scan the QR reader. So now I would like to invite our esteemed panelists to join us in a discussion, and I'll go through their bios first before we start with their presentations and answering some questions. Our first panelist is Dr. Barry O'Dwyer. Dr. Barry O'Dwyer is a research fellow at the SFI Centre for Energy, Climate and Marine at University College Cork. And in his role, Barry leads the development of the EPA-funded Climate Ireland program, which works directly with local and sectoral decision makers to advance the development and implementation of adaptation action, a really important thing for us in Ireland. And Barry also leads the Climate Impacts and Adaptation Group at MARE at UCC. Through a wide range of nationally and internationally funded research projects, their group is aiming to develop decision-relevant climate adaptation information. Hi, Barry. Thanks. And our second panelist this evening is Alistair McKinstry. Alistair is in the environmental program. He's the lead at something called iCheck, which is the Irish Centre for High-End Computing. And he works on climate and weather modeling and has been responsible for publishing data for the CMIP-5 and CMIP-6 experiments, which he'll explain tonight. And both of those are for the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Reporting, or the IPCC reporting. And he has processed 4 petabytes, which I read is 4,000 terabytes, I hope that's right, 4 petabytes of data for the EC Earth and other climate models. His background is in high performance computing, coupling and scaling climate models in EU Horizon 2020 projects. Hi, Alistair.
Hi, Cara.
Good to see you tonight. And our final panelist this evening is Keith Lampkin. Keith is the senior climatologist at Met Éireann, and there he works with government departments, academia, international organizations, and others to help promote the development of climate services both at home and abroad. So he has a background in physics and earth science measurements, and he previously held the role of chief scientist at Met Éireann's flagship weather station, Valentia Observatory. That's where he led the development of numerous national monitoring networks, including Ireland's weather balloon, solar radiation, and stratospheric ozone programs. But now his interests have changed from measuring the climate to using his knowledge to assist sectors adapting to our changing environment. And actually, Keith has some fabulous videos on the Met Éireann website that are worth checking out. So welcome, Keith.
Thanks, Cara. Good evening, everybody. Delighted to be here.
Thanks. Alistair, I'm going to start with you. The topic is climate projections in Ireland, but I think it's really useful to start with a global perspective about how we understand what's happening at a global level. So could you explain a bit about how these global projections are taken and what sort of information goes into them?
Okay, so at iCheck Centre for High-End Computing, we work for EPA and for Ireland and Europe and the world on modeling the future projections. We help develop a global and weather model, climate models, which we feed in potential scenarios, data sets representing the kind of greenhouse gases, the land use changes that we expect to see. And we start to see what that outcome will be. So these are effectively kind of weather models, but run into the future. And we run these for various different scenarios. We have a set of scenarios that have been chosen by social scientists and economists, etc., on potential futures for the world. Runs going from sustainability, basically we do everything we can to drop the greenhouse gases as fast as we can, all the way through middle of the road, as we call it, which is the Paris Accord that we've agreed to, want to call it regional rivalry, and then on to fully fossil fuel development. So these range between 2.6 and 8.5 watts per meter squared, solar heating as we call it. And we've done this for the recent IPCC report in an experiment called CMIP6. Our previous work was done for CMIP5, the previous experiment about 8 years before. We compare those two sets of results. So what we've seen here is the potential temperature rise for all of those experiments. We first modeled the 20th century to see if our models are right and how accurate our models can project what we've already seen. And we see that gives us the black line we see, which is the variation in the kind of the weather of the model. And then we see 4 different colors for the various different scenarios. They're fairly close together until about 2050, then starting to separate out. And we see a temperature rises then varying across the whole globe from about 1.5 up to about 4 to 5 degrees temperature change all told. And you'll see a big difference across the globe. You can see temperature changes of 20 degrees up in the North Pole, less so down in south in that world. And then we do this similarly for what we call precipitation rainfall. That's a much more broad spread picture. And we see that when we look at that here, we see a drying out in certain areas, particularly the Mediterranean, that will have impact on our food supplies. We see it wetter in other places. The big dash that you see, of course, in the Pacific, there is the El Nino effect that that you'll have heard about. You will see a large green effect going over the Sahara. The Sahara does get slightly wetter, but this picture is slightly misleading because the percentage change is quite large, but the actual increase in rainfall isn't so big. The rainfall pictures are much more noisy than the others, but we see basically about a 7 or 8% increase overall throughout the world per degree of temperature rise. And then we do the same thing for ice. The sea ice in the north, in the Arctic, is very important for determining the weather patterns around Europe and over Ireland. And it varies throughout the year. So this is the sea ice fraction in September, which is at the end of the summer. It's when the seas are warmest. And again, we're seeing here the sea ice fraction is narrowing out as we head through various scenarios. And we start seeing by the middle of the century that the sea ice has almost completely disappeared by the middle of the century. And that's kind of important for us.
Wow. Those are stark projections, Alistair. How certain are we about these projections?
Okay, almost certain is the best answer for most of these projections, for the level of these projections. We run a large number of what we call an ensemble. Ireland, iCheck, and the EC Earth program we're in are one of about 30 or so groups around the world running such simulations. And we compare all of our results together in these CMIP experiment, coupled model into comparison project experiment, to see how certain we are. And when we get the same results, it means we have a very high degree of confidence. When they differ, we can quote those scenarios. So if you saw the report yesterday given by Professor Thorne on the IPCC report, they have detailed quantified statements on each of the variables that we're talking about. So it can be very confident of the temperature rise, very confident that there will be a large increase in precipitation, less confident about things like less confident about other variables such as the sea ice changes over the Arctic and Antarctic. But,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so then take those global forecasts then, and can you relate them down to Ireland? I know we're a small body of land, but are we able to kind of see what those global projections will be for our country?
Yeah. So what we do is we then downscale, as we call it. We run those results, which are at a very coarse grid of about 100 kilometers over the world. And we downscale that down to about 2 to 4 kilometers over Ireland and Europe in particular. And we get the detailed results. Here's again for the 4 scenarios that are described for the period 2020 to 2050. We see a temperature range increase of about 0.8 to 1.6 degrees across the country under the 1.6 scenario, the 2.6 scenarios, all the way up to 4 degrees under the highest temperatures by the end of the range. It's warmer in the east and the south, but the temperature change is not as dramatic across the country. We see wetter winters, drier summers overall, but we see a dramatic increase in number of very wet days. So these are here we're comparing our 2 experiments. The OCP 45, the ones on the left are from the previous round of experiments. The ones on the right are the current ones, where we see a dramatic up to 30 to 50% increase in number of very wet days over 30 millimeters. This is both during the summertime, both in the winter time in particular, but also the events that we see in the summer will be more dramatic. So the summer will be drier overall, but when we get rainfall, it'll be more dramatic. And we've seen that this summer across Europe with the flooding events in Germany and so on that's been happening. We see more heat waves, heading up to 20 heat waves per year by the end of the period 2040, 2060 under SSP 8.5. Our current path, by the way, is somewhere between these 2 sets of pictures, between the 2, 4, somewhere between the 4.5 and the 8.5 scenarios is why we chose those. So we're seeing 10 to 20 more heat waves per year, which will impact on crop growth in particular. We're seeing a dramatic drop in the number of frost days. This will have an impact then on the amount of insects that will survive the winter, so that will have impact on agriculture, which is quite important. So we're seeing under 8.5, we're seeing an almost complete drop in frost by the end of the century. We see an increase in what we call the grazing season. This is the length of the time that it's over 5 degrees in Ireland in the summertime. And that goes up to about 40 to 50 days all told. This is generally good news. This is the good news for agriculture. The not so good news, the caveat that we need to be careful of it, is that while it demonstrates that it will be warmer and grass could potentially grow in March, in February, for example. That might not be happening today. Those fields might be flooded with that rainfall we described earlier. So we're working with the likes of Chagas to come up with better measures on grazing growth and how that can be extended. And then we push that through onto other information for solar impact and for wind power changes.
Wow. I mean, that modeling those are numbers I thought you would say we'd see in 2100, not, 2040 to 2060. So that is really shocking when you're talking about 10 to 20 heat waves a year and 30 to 50% increase in precipitation. Thanks for starting the conversation off with those stark numbers. Keith, if I could go to you, I mean, it's probably fair to say the general public would know Met Éireann mostly for weather forecasting and weather observations, but can you talk about your role in these kind of climate projections and maybe just remind us what the difference between weather and climate actually is?
Sure. Well, so the main difference between weather and climate, what I like to say is weather is what we see when we look out the window. It's the current state of the environment. Climate, what we mean by climate is the average of the weather patterns you get over a long period of time, typically about 30 years or so. So when our weather forecasters are on TV and they're saying it's hotter than normal or colder than normal, typically what they mean by that is that by normal, they mean the average weather conditions we would have got in Ireland over the last 3 full decades, so 1981 to 2010. And actually, Met Éireann, as well as all the other Met services all around the world at the moment, we're redefining what that new normal is, because we've now completed the last full decade. So we're now redefining that normal period from 1991 to 2020. And all around the world, we'll have a new normal in climatological terms. So that's the difference between weather and climate. Now, when it comes to Met Éireann's relationship with projections and climate projections and so forth, you're going to go back about nearly 2 decades or so. That's when Met Éireann hosted what was called the Community Climate Change Consortium for Ireland, or C4I. It was hosted in the headquarters in Glasnevin. And really, it was a consortium made up of a number of Irish players, including the likes of UCD, the EPA, SEAI, Science Foundation, our friends over in iCheck, as well as others. And this organisation, this consortium, these were the first to put together regional climate projections for Ireland. So that kind of really started the conversation going for Ireland, going back nearly 20 years. At that point, soon after that, then in 2008, Met Éireann were one of the 8 core members to join and sign up to the EC Earth Consortium. So the EC Earth is a European consortium of global models. And that's the model that Alistair was showing just there, those nice animations, that particular global model made up of European members, the 8 core members, including Met Éireann, working with 32 associate members there as well, including our friends iCheck, as well as many other international players. From then, a number of initiatives, downscaling initiatives, happened throughout Ireland. Downscaling is a trick we often use in weather forecasting, where you take the global model and you rerun almost a postage stamp over Ireland. And because you're running it on a much finer resolution, you can use slightly different physics and actually improve on the result and increase the skill. So we adopt that same downscaling technique to the climate models, like the global models Alistair showed, and we got some of those nice results and so forth that Alistair has shown there as well. At the moment, what's happening in Ireland is that Met Éireann, along with the Marine Institute and the EPA, is jointly funding an awful lot of that work and pushing it forward. But on top of that, there's also then the Met Éireann themselves. We're actually beefing up our climate development capacities internally as well. Our high resolution model that we use for doing all the downscaling for our weather forecasts, we're also using that same model now, but we're running in a climate mode as well, a model called HCLIM. So we're adding to even more climate projections for Ireland, adding to that data, that information base. And if all of that wasn't enough, there's also many other initiatives outside of Met Éireann, so other academia organisations who are doing a different type of downscaling, as well as other energy balance models and other climate models looking at the climate sensitivity as well. So there's a huge amount, I'd actually go as far as to say an unprecedented amount of climate projection information happening, not just in Met Éireann, but in the wider community. And if all of that wasn't enough, some very clever people in Met Éireann are actually taking all these models, these weather models and forecast models, and running them not just necessarily into the future, but also back into the past as well. And because of that, we're able to get even extra information of how Ireland's past has also changed.
You're like the Luke O'Neill of weather, Keith. That's a lot of information, a lot of data out there. So what kind of changes in the climate have Met Éireann been observing?
So thankfully, Met Éireann have been supported for an awful long time, both in making our own weather measurements, but a huge network of volunteer observers as well, literally hundreds and hundreds of volunteers around the country over the last century plus. So we have an enormous amount of actual measured data that tells us an awful lot about the climate. And we couple this as well then with this reanalysis, this modeled data as well as other huge initiatives involving digitizing an awful lot of this data. So we digitized it and added all to the network. We end up with an enormous amount of actual data points for Ireland. Now, if we dig under the surface and try and somehow summarize all of that together, there was actually there's a branch of climate, a governing body under the United Nations called GCOS, and they kind of outline 54 what they call essential climate variables for Ireland. So what every country should be measuring and how to monitor the climate. Now, Ireland, not just Met Éireann, but other organisations in Ireland measure quite a lot of those as well. And a landmark report came out there only a few weeks ago, where all these essential climate variables for Ireland were all kind of gathered together in the one report under the banner between funded by Met Éireann, the Marine Institute, and the EPA. It's called the Status of Ireland's Climate Report, and that's a great place to go to get a summary of all these data points and how Ireland's climate is changing. And just to highlight a few, we're seeing that the land is changing, land use. We're seeing more forests, and the marine side of the house as well. We're seeing that sea surface temperatures are increasing. And at sea level is rising. And if I can share this one graph with you here. And we're seeing, just following on from what Alistair was saying there as well, with regards to the temperature side and the precipitation side, the rainfall side. Here we're looking to see how Ireland's temperature has actually changed over the last 120 years or so. And what we're looking at here is the red bars are showing when the temperature in Ireland for that particular year was higher than normal, climate normal. The blue bars when it's lower than climate normal. And what we can really see towards the end there, a huge amount of red. So we're seeing an awful lot of years higher than normal. 19 of the last 20 years. The only one, the big blue bar in 2010, the big freeze, for those who remember back then. So with a warming climate, and that green line that you see there as well, that's kind of the running mean of the Irish climate. That matches relatively closely to the darker line there as well. So that darker line is the global running average of how global warming is happening. So ballpark, Ireland is kind of seeing the same kind of signal that we're seeing in a global warming point of view. What's also interesting, and we've also seen in the records embedded in this latest Status of Ireland climate report as well, is that a warmer atmosphere can carry more moisture. So that it has potential to rain down more. And what we're seeing again through measurements made by Met Éireann sites, along with our partners and all the volunteers, is that we're seeing about a 6% increase in the amount of annual rainfall happening in recent decades compared to the decades that happened before that. And again, it's very similar in line to what we'd expect and what we're seeing on the global circuit as well.
That blue bar there at the end, I presume that's the beast from the east that you were referring to, am I right?
It was that white Christmas that we all wished for, and as soon as it came, we all wished it would go away again.
Okay, wow, that's really shocking data there for Ireland. So before I go to Barry to relate all of this to how we adapt, just want to draw your attention to Yvonne Cannon's comment in the chat there, who has directed those of you who haven't done the Slido poll yet with the code you can go to complete the poll. And of course, you're welcome to put questions in the Q&A box, which we'll get to shortly. So Barry, your work is directly related to helping Ireland adapt to climate change, and it's clear this is something we need to do. So what kind of changes and impacts can we expect as a result of climate change?
Yeah, no, thanks. So I think, as we've seen from both Keith and Alistair, Ireland's climate has changed an awful lot already, in line with what we'd see at the global scale, and we expect to see that continue into the future. And it's going to present a really wide range of impacts and but also opportunities, as I've seen Niall has mentioned there in the chat as well. So when we look to the future, I mean, the obvious things we can see is Ireland is an island nation. It's surrounded by the sea. We've sea level rise occurring. And so we would expect to see more coastal flooding, more coastal inundation. Similarly, as Keith suggested, increases in extreme rainfall events resulting in increased river flooding. But the opposite to that is the climate change projections are also showing increased periods of drought, and that would be particularly during the summer. So that's where we have to start thinking about crops, water supply, etc. And when we think about climate change impacts, it's risk that we really have to focus on here. The data, the information on climate changes in our weather patterns is one aspect. We also have to think about what's exposed to these risks and what are the vulnerabilities of those exposures. And I think a really good example in the context of Dublin is when we look at water supply. Everyone speaks about Ireland as a country with a lot of water. It seems to rain all the time, yet our water supply system is pretty much at a knife edge in the Dublin area. So that's our exposed system. And it's very vulnerable because it's very old and we have a lot of leakages. So when we think about climate change impacts and opportunities into the future, we have to go far beyond the hazard that we face and start to think about what's that hazard going to affect and how sensitive will those receptors be to this hazard, and then think about this in the entire context of how we develop. So I think it's a complex question, but it's a question that we're working through Climate Ireland and also through the work that we do at MARI to actually work with decision makers to understand what are the risks posed by climate change for their particular area. And the risks posed by climate change are generally, it's a global issue, but they're localized impacts. So they occur at very fine spatial scales. And that's something that we have to really increase our understanding around. What are the risks that these changes pose for us from the really known risks, such as sea level rise? But when we start to think about agriculture, what crops will we be growing in circumstances of longer grazing seasons, higher temperatures, but potentially flooded fields? So these are the kind of questions that we seek to answer through this. So I think, you can think about the current risks from weather events, and then we have to look to the future and think about, well, what additional risks might we face? An example of that would be risks related to heat. And I think the recent heat wave showed what pressures that can apply and how, if we look to the future and think about the projections, the number of heat waves by mid-century, what might that mean for elderly populations? What might it mean for biodiversity, nature reserves, etc.? And I think this adaptation until recently hasn't really been looked at. And I think mitigation has formed a key focus. And there's an obvious reason for that. We don't want to fall back on adaptation as being the answer for our inability to decrease emissions. But I think what's very clear now is some climate change impacts are baked in regardless of what we do around emissions reductions. And we have to start to plan for these now. And this is a new area of planning. And I think that's really important to think about, because our planners are faced with an issue where they have historical planning that's been done to develop our cities, etc. They have to deal with that in the context of climate change risk. And they also have to think about their future development. What are we going to do? So it is quite a complicated area. The risks are spatially discrete and also at quite fine spatial scales.
You're looking at these risks all the time. So just personally, I know which ones worry me, but I'm curious, which is the risk you're most concerned about for, say, 2050?
I think, as I said, Ireland is an island nation. We'd be really concerned about sea level rise. I'm based in Cork currently. If I go into Cork city centre in a high spring tide, there's a good chance I'll see water coming over the quay walls. So if we think about that in the context of any kind of sea level rise, whether that be, 5 centimetres, 10 centimetres, suddenly we have an issue where one of our major cities is being flooded on a very regular basis. So this is something we really have to think about. And similarly, in the context of Dublin, we have the eastern rail corridor as well is already very much at risk from coastal erosion and flooding. These are long-term pieces of infrastructure. We can't just build them overnight. So we have to actually think strategically as to how we're going to do this. But that also presents opportunities. And I think in terms of climate change, it is a big, dark problem. It's a complex problem, but it's also a way we can rethink how we do things, how we plan, and actually start to plan strategically in the context of the projections overall, but also thinking about where do we want to be socially, economically, by mid-century, end of century, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think of this every time I take the DART into Dublin, just how exposed it is to sea level rise and erosion. But I mean, you talk about opportunities, and I just think, well, we're going to have to rebuild the DART line further inland or build it higher. I mean, how do we really adapt to climate change with these kind of risks?
Well, I mean, there are some decisions that are going to have to be taken around infrastructure that has been there, as I said, historically has been located in these areas. But when we start to think about future development and we think about heat risk, an example, flood risk in major urban areas, like a very probably used answer for that is green areas. We can use green areas to decrease the urban heat island effect in our key urban areas to provide areas of reprieve from heat, as an example. And we can also use it for flood alleviation. So hard surfaces, it's obvious. Hard surfaces means runoff and precipitation runs into drainage systems quicker, etc. So by using, in that case, nature-based solutions, we can actually start to think about improving the way we live. And we also have to think about it in the context of emissions reductions, what these kind of green areas can provide in terms of active travel, walking, cycling, etc.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mary. We're going to get to audience questions shortly. So those of you who have burning questions, do start putting them in the Q&A function right now so that our team can bump them up. You can upvote them, and if you like a question that you want them to ask. But before we do that, maybe we could get someone from the Climate Action Regional Office to put the poll results up just to see what other people have started to observe in our changing climate. So the main ones: flooding for sure, hotter in summer, higher levels of humidity, rain changes, more rain. Lots of things that have been discussed today. I think that's really interesting because, you know, it just shows us that climate change is no longer this thing that scientists tell us is going to happen, but we can see it and observe it in our own lives too. So thank you for that, Dave. If we could go back now to the panelists, and just before I take some questions from the audience, I think it would be useful, Alistair, if you could maybe come back and respond. I know Niall asked a question in the chat there. Niall Conway asked a great question, just complimenting you on your presentation, and then also kind of following up on what Barry was saying about opportunities and these climate projections that you're presenting, and they do present possible opportunities, maybe in agriculture and energy. And I know you showed some maps there looking at the potential for solar. So could you maybe talk a little bit more about what opportunities you see in a changing climate, Alistair?
I mean, the kind of opportunities we're seeing here, you know, we have a huge amount of potential that for wind, solar, that is underestimated. The idea that we can get up to 1.5, 2 gigawatts of solar. That some of the results that we demonstrated that the wind and solar are fairly stable over 100 years is very important for anybody building large infrastructure. We will have longer periods for building for fletching out for agriculture, and that will be important as the Mediterranean dries out. You know, we will become more important as part of for feeding Europe as that happens. So that kind of becomes important. We're relatively stable compared to most of Europe for our climate in that, and that's one of the things we do need to take advantage of when it comes to that agriculture. So those are opportunities we can extend on that. Yeah.
You talked about the need to feed Europe. Do you think we're going to have to change what we grow in order to be able to do that?
Almost certainly, given given what we've seen in terms of the drier periods, that impacts on agriculture. And I know Met Erin have been working a lot, and we have been working with, both of us have been working with Teagasc and with farmers as to what crops we will be growing in that period. There'll be parts of the country in which traditional potatoes won't be a feature, won't be realistic. We'll see what other, we can see what other crops we will be growing as that changes.
Thanks. Keith, we've seen lots of extreme weather events this summer in places like the US and China and Germany, and loss of life and property tragically with those. So how do we compare in Ireland regarding extreme weather events? Is that something we're going to have to worry about? Because obviously that would have a bearing on food production, as Alistair was discussing.
Yeah, so I mean, bearing in mind, to set the backdrop, I mean, we've always had extreme events. What climate change is doing, it's potentially exaggerating some of those. Or as some people like to think of it, it's almost like a performance-enhancing drug. Global warming is acting like an enhancement to some of these weather extreme events. So it'd be unfair to say a weather extreme event was caused by climate change, for example. But what an awful lot of scientists are trying to do at the moment, they're trying to attribute how much blame is global warming related to that particular extreme event. I mean, a big report that was out there recently, the IPCC's Working Group 1 science report. I mean, there's evidence in that to say that there's an increase in the number of global extremes, excuse me, due to global warming. And do we see that in Ireland? Well, we see extreme events in Ireland. We've like I say, we've always seen these. One of the worst extreme events in Ireland actually dates back to 1859. It was the worst storm ever to happen in the Irish Sea. 800 people lost their lives and over 130 ships destroyed. Now, nobody was blaming climate change for that particular event. Excuse me. But as we're seeing the temperatures and also the precipitation almost tracking in Ireland what we're seeing at a global level, as we see the more extreme happens at a global level, one can expect something similar. And because of this is one of the reasons Met Erin is actually launching a new research program at the moment in order to try and investigate how extremes are actually likely to change. An awful lot of Alistair's models there that he showed us show us a change in trends. We want to do a little bit of extra work and actually focus on extremes into the future and how likely they are to change themselves. There has been some studies done in the past as well here in Ireland looking at extremes and how global warming has to blame. In particular, there was a report out recently on looking at the flooding in November 2009 here in Ireland. And that particular report found that there wasn't enough evidence to actually attribute global warming as the reason for that event. But then again, Ireland is a very small country in the side of the Atlantic as well. And often a lot of these, what are called climate attribution studies, typically need a much larger area in order to focus on.
That brings up a good question from Erin Moorhead in the chat here. She's wondering, and maybe either Keith or Alistair or Barry, you can answer this. Are there any models that actually consider mortality rates in these kind of extreme weather projections and what the impact of climate change could be on potential loss of life?
So I could probably just add, maybe get the conversation started there. So at the beginning of this month, actually, the World Meteorological Organization released a report, which is one of the most comprehensive reports done into extreme weather and the loss of life, as well as economic losses as well. And they studied the last 50 years. And what they found was, that the number of extreme events happening globally had increased, and they're attributing a part of that blame to global warming. So because of that, more extreme events, you're going to see more damage. Now, also, you've got to bear in mind in the backdrop as well, the population of the planet is increasing as well. So we have more houses and more infrastructure. So even if the same event happens 50 years ago and happened again today, there's more infrastructure that could be damaged. So you have to bear that in mind as well. But what the report found that an increase in the extreme events, coupled with the increase in infrastructure, was leading to naturally an increase in economic damage across the world globally. The interesting thing linked to mortalities is they actually found there was a decrease in the number of mortalities. And they were attributing that to because there's so many scientists now working in the area of climate science and in the area of early warning systems from a weather forecasting point of view, and weather forecasting and warnings and color-coded warnings, as well as what Barry was talking about there, we're beginning to build our infrastructures in such a way that they're more climate resilient. We've actually seen a loss in the rate of mortalities, largely based on these early warning systems.
Wow, well, that's a piece of good news there. Barry, did you have your hand up about that, or was that?
Yeah, no, it was just another thing. I suppose it's not directly related to mortality, but there is work done, and we've done some work for Dublin actually, that looked at rates of heat stress being produced as a result of projected changes in temperature. And that can start to give you an idea of, you know, again, where the vulnerable populations are in relation to heat stress. So that's a really key thing there as well. So
is that something we have to worry about in Ireland?
I mean, absolutely, and particularly in the large urban centres like Dublin, where we have the increases in average and extreme temperatures being enhanced by the city itself. So essentially the concrete in the city holds the heat better, so it enhances the temperature effects there as well. So we would see it as being a potential risk by mid-century, and particularly again we have to think about it's for vulnerable populations, elderly people, younger people, and also people with underlying conditions. But again, this kind of brings up the whole idea of hospitals and these very temperature controlled environments. Small changes in average temperature or extreme temperature affects their operating conditions. And all we have to do is look at the heat waves in the past and to see how various infrastructure has been affected to start to understand how we're going to see this occur more frequently in the future.
Where I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, they had cooling centers, you know, for people who didn't have air conditioning that needed to cool off. And I'm now seeing those cooling centers showing up in places like Seattle where they never needed them. Is that something you think we'll have to have in Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I think already being considered in Dublin around providing water, etc., within parks themselves. But there's lots of very interesting things we can do. And an example would be, I've seen a study that talks about the fact you can put trees in, or you can paint your roofs white, and that'll actually decrease the overall temperature of the area. And essentially, if you look to the Mediterranean countries, most of the buildings are white and light color, and there's a reason for that.
Well, I'm banjaxed in this room, trying to keep warm in here. Ronan Mulligan asks a good question about insurance companies. I had always heard that insurance companies were quite on top of the climate modeling, and he was wondering what their interests in quantifying potential damage from climate-related events are. And I'm personally wondering, are they raising their premiums as a result of climate models? Do any of you guys have a lead on that?
I think internationally they certainly are. And there's examples of that, particularly in Australia, and particularly in relation to sea level rise. So in terms of sea level rise, there are now models in Australia that can estimate how many mortgage lifetimes they expect your house to have before it will be inundated. And lots of houses are classed as within half a mortgage lifetime, this house will no longer be viable. So they certainly are starting to look at climate models and projections of change into the future.
Don Kiernan has a question here about sea level rise. So there have been pictures in the media showing places like Howth as an island in 2030 because of sea level rise. So is that a reality? 2030 is not that far away. Is that realistic?
I think it depends on the rate of rise, essentially. And I suppose to come back to this, that we've done some modelling for Dublin as well, but it was based on a 0.7 metre rise plus a storm, and that did cut off Howth in that context. But I think as well we'd have to see it as that high spring tide plus a storm. Is Storm Xavier was what was modelled on top, and plus a 0.7 metre rise. I mean, I think we have to highlight as well that many of the sea level rise models available on a global basis now that you can go and look at on the internet, they're quite simple. in how they're developed, but they absolutely provide useful information. But when we start to get into the level of Dublin, we consider tidal regimes, a lot of locally specific circumstances that these models don't capture.
So this is the likes of like the Climate Central models that you can go online and type in any city in the world. Are you saying that they're probably overestimating the extent of sea level rise, or
potentially over or underestimating? And the reason for that, again, is a data issue. So when we look at sea level rise on the east coast of Ireland, we want to use the best elevation models we can find. And they tend to be for very small areas developed. So the east coast of Ireland would be an example. Whereas when we go globally, we tend to use models that are more error in terms of their actual elevations. That's a really key factor there. But again, not to suggest the work that's been done by Climate Central is very good. But we have to, once we go into, looking at HOTED as an example, we have to be a little bit careful about how we interpret the model findings.
Yeah. Keith, you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, thanks, Cara. And I think Barry hits the nail on the head there, really, with regards to the difference between the global models and these downscaled national models. I mean, the global models are great for telling you a general global picture. They use coarser resolutions, and they're designed specifically to kind of give you a general feel of how the planet is likely to change. The reason you go to this great expense, computational as well as financial expense, to downscale these models is because when you get down to those city resolutions, you're looking to try and make localized decisions, and for that you need localized models. And that's why the latest iteration of model downscaling that's happening between Met Air and the Marine Institute and the EPA run out of iCheck, they're coupling that in with the coast as well. So rather than just modeling the atmosphere and downscaling the atmosphere, it's also downscaling the sea and how the sea ties into the atmosphere. And what this will do, it'll give us much greater resolution on the likes of sea level rise in around the Irish coasts. So they'll be coming online in a few years' time. And again, the science is always evolving, but bear in mind, it's very important for local decision making. You need to be using the local models.
Absolutely. And we have RTE's Philip Boucher-Hayes in the house, I see. It's an honor, Philip. And he has a question for Alistair about the Status of Ireland report, saying that it wasn't able to say much about how much wind strength had changed and maximum gust speeds and number of windstorms, etc. So Alistair, could you shed any light on projections for wind on the island?
Okay, we've done a bunch of work on wind projections and forecasting. Mostly, we've done used the outputs of this for a wind atlas, which is in current use by SEAI and everywhere else for deciding where to place wind farms. One of the main questions that we wanted to answer with the long-term projections was the stability of the wind. I mean, will there be wind in 20, 30, 50 years time if you build a wind farm? The short answer to that basically is yes. There will be a reduction in wind as the temperature goes about 10%. When it comes to gusting,
sorry, did you just say a reduction in wind?
There will be a reduction in the wind.
A problem, then. Yeah. Okay.
Basically, as our weather is kind of driven by the temperature difference between the equator and the poles, and the poles are warming up by about 20 degrees, and so overall, the energy becomes more energetic, but the wind speeds will drop on average over that period. When it comes to gustiness, we will see greater storms. We primarily see larger storms. One of the things we're worried that we pay attention a lot of attention to is the storm track. So the jet stream typically passing will probably move further south in our current projections, and that will lead to more storms potentially tracking over Ireland. And that's one of the things we need to be concerned about. The challenge is that extreme events are relatively infrequent, and they take a lot of modeling to get the extremes right. So it takes a degree of work with that. But calculating the gust strength is very important for wind turbines. The gustiness, the long-term periods of that gusts, and a lot of detailed work is going on with that. And we're working on models specifically for this, working for the wind industry to calculate exactly for that. And also, for example, when we get to offshore, so a key challenge when we move to offshore wind farms there's a huge amount of wind energy available off the west coast. 30 gigawatts of wind will potentially come, but where the windows for servicing those will be relatively short. And so we need to get them. We need to be able to predict in detail when that is possible. Working with the wind industry on exactly how they're capable, using the models that Keith was mentioning, which is with the modeling for around the coasts, including wave, current, sea models into our coupled models. So calculating not just the weather, but those, but the wave and wind environment into all of that.
Okay, I know you were talking about wind there, but and obviously a negative impact on wind energy there with that slight 10% reduction. Did you look at solar radiance at all, or?
We did, and one of the things we do see is again a very slight reduction, but a very slight reduction, about 1% in solar reduction. We're not going to get the long blue skies of the Mediterranean as the temperature rises up. It will be what we expect and what we see today, which is a relatively grey island, but it's still warming.
Wow. Okay. The top rated question now in the upvoting is from Donald Adams, asking if there's been any work on these based on these climate projections relating to biodiversity loss. We often forget that we are in both a climate and biodiversity emergency. So any framework for references on biodiversity loss that you guys know of?
Yes, there is some. Not enough is a short answer. I think Barry will step in with further on this. We find that we've done some work with the NBWS on trying to track what ranges of various species will change. In the recent report by one of my colleagues, we were tracking about 46 species, the range of about 46 potential species that will rise up to the country. A 0.1 degree in temperature rise is quite significant for things like gonorrhea and other invasive species that we've seen in the West, in Galway and in Sligo, Mayo. We don't.
Meaning they do better, is what you're saying. They'll thrive.
They do. They expand dramatically into ACL, for example, demonstrated, but we don't actually have enough work on the biodiversity, on the effects of temperature and the biodiversity.
Yeah, this would be probably related to the question of adapting, and maybe Barry, you can answer this. Brian Harding has said that, you know, really what we need is better institutional governance structures to deal with adaptation. So do you think that we have those structures, or how can we lead in governance to be able to adapt?
So do we have? So I think I have to say I think great strides have been made over the last number of years in terms of adaptation and putting governance structures in place, and I completely agree with the comment that we need the governance structures to support adaptation. I mean, the examples I gave will be, we did have the publication of the National Adaptation Framework, so all of our local authorities and government departments have developed adaptation strategies at this point, with the establishment of the Climate Action Regional Offices as well to support local authorities in doing their work. And we also have the likes of Climate Ireland, the Translate project funding going to the work being done by iCheck to also support this in adaptation. I think that's increasing across the board. There's a lot more work to do on this, so it's certainly not done, but I think it's increasing in scope around adaptation. But I mean, ultimately for me, the end goal is that when we plan an infrastructure project, we account for projected climate change. We don't think of it as adaptation. All of our engineers are used to working with threshold values around temperature, precipitation, etc. They just have to now be using a new set of values. And that's really key. So adaptation is very important, but it should actually be part of sustainable development, along with mitigation, along with biodiversity conservation. They're also interconnected. And when we start siloing things off, I think it becomes quite difficult. And I just see Keith there as well coming in.
That's a really good point. Keith, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just build on what Barry is saying. I mean, adaptation has come a long way already. But again, this is Climate Action Week. So the plans are all great, and having all this knowledge is great, but it's also important to actually act on that. And we're seeing a dramatic increase in the number of stakeholder engagement we're seeing in Met Éireann, of people actually willing, sectors willing and trying to act on that. At the moment, we're involved in a project with the Department of Housing and Standards, Sustainable Energy Ireland and others, who are looking at the building standards, how to make sure we build our houses in such a way, our hospitals, our nursing homes, so that we are adapting to future climates, that we're able to cool the buildings just as well as heat them. We're getting an awful lot of engagement from transport sector, who are looking to make sure that they have adequate drainage on the roads for new roads that they build and so forth. So there is an awful lot of will and there is an awful lot of action there, but we do need greater coordination. And Barry mentioned the Translate project. One of the things we actually suffer from in Ireland, which is a healthy complaint, is almost information overload. There's an abundance of climate data, both past and future, available. And what the Translate project is aiming to do is bring all the climate stakeholders together and actually standardise those climate projections for Ireland, so that all of Ireland are using a kind of a singing from the same hymn sheet, if you like. We're all using the same baseline assumptions, so we can all move forward. Very similar to population assumptions and so forth as well, how we build our schools and roads and so forth as well. So yes, adaptation has come a long way. There's an awful lot of coordination there based on adaptation, and we're beginning to see an awful lot of action, but we do need to support that action in order for adaptation to be a success.
That's good to hear. Now, we've run out of time, but there is a top-rated question that I think we can all answer as a yes or no question very quickly, and I think it's a great question to end on. Katia is asking about a study that came out in the journal Sustainability in June, concluding that Ireland was one of the top 5 countries best situated to survive climate change. I know I read that study with great interest. So whether or not you read the study, yes or no question, if we could start with Alistair, would you agree Ireland in the top 5 for surviving climate change?
Yes-ish.
Yes-ish. Keith?
I think survive is semi-provocative, but I think we're in a great position, assuming we adapt to that change that we know is coming.
Yeah.
Okay, and Barry?
I'm going to agree with Keith, because I think he qualified it very well.
Yeah.
So we could say we are blessed in Ireland. We just need to do more on adaptation. Would that be a final conclusion? And do more, obviously, to try and stop the worst impacts of climate change too. Well, my thanks to all of you, Barry, Alistair, and Keith, for your time, and to all of the attendees who asked great questions and registered for the event. And of course, huge thanks to Dublin Climate Action regional offices for organizing this event and for handling all the tech behind the scenes and sending all the great questions. So there were some of you that we didn't get to your great questions, but apologies for that. And a recording of the webinar will be made available on the Dublin Climate Action Week website in due course. So check out all the other events going on this week at dublinclimateactionweek.ie. And thanks to you all, and have a great evening.